Are you ready to get spicy? Because this is gonna be a bit of an interesting one. In fact, it's so interesting that even the spoiler warning is really weird, because yeah, this is a spoiler for Xenoblade 2, I do that all the time, but I also have to say lore but not plot spoilers for Xenosaga, because some precedent for this potentially being real comes from a very important lore background detail thing about Xenosaga that you don't find out about until right before the final boss of episode 3, but I don't need to talk about any actual plot details that happen because of it. So I don't know if that will change whether or not you want to watch this video based on the spoilering Xenosaga I do in it, but that's the way things are. I should also mention that this is almost certainly not real, or at least not intended by the developers, because the thing that initially made me realize this could be a thing was almost certainly just a result of a stripped down development team trying to finish the game for probably a Nintendo mandated deadline on time and reusing assets because of that, but I think it's a very interesting thought experiment at the very least. So you know that big and cool space station scene at the beginning of chapter 10, and how there's all those employees of it walking around before it cuts to Klaus and Galea? Well, those people are only on screen for like a minute and a half of the entire game, and when I looked at their models, just rewatching the scene for a different video, I noticed some pretty interesting things. I think I realized this initially a long time ago, but a lot of these guys look like other characters from the actual game. Like, again, I'm pretty sure this is just reusing some face geometry just to get more human character models done in time, but a lot of the people just kind of look like some regular NPCs you might see around in one of the various cities in Allrest. But the guy who says we've been locked out by Professor Klaus, who I believe is actually voiced by Adam Howden in the dub, looks a lot like a younger Amalthus, and then the actual guy running the station, who is voiced by Gramps in the dub, just kind of looks like Gort. So take those visual similarities, and there is actually a bunch of voice crossover in the dub, not in the Japanese, because everyone except the Adam Howden guy I talked about before, who has a voice in that cutscene before it cuts to Klaus, who is also Adam Howden, is voiced by a party member. Morag, Zeke, Bridget, and Tora are all there. Some of them are using different voices, some of them are using different accents, but it is still clearly them after a couple listens. And then there's also the fact that reincarnation is a common theme in the Xeno series, and it tends to apply mostly to people who have a connection to the Zohar. These guys were all ground zero for the conduit blowing up. And Xenosaga has a collective unconscious. And we could go a little further, because Xenosaga has some artificial biomechanical entities called Realians. One of your party members is a Realian, and they're different from characters like Cosmos. In Xenosaga, Cosmos is just an android. She's 100% mechanical, but Realians have biological stuff. They actually function a bit more similarly to humans, but heavily genetically engineered and capable of being superhuman just in terms of their design, but they are still partially biological. And it is confirmed in a Xenosaga databook that Realians do have consciousnesses that pass into the collective once they die, and all that stuff. So, people down in Moratha got turned into Guldos because of core crystals, and Guldos don't seem to really think at all, so their minds, their consciousnesses probably were no longer tied to those bodies. Everyone on the space station, except probably Klaus, likely got incinerated almost instantaneously, and that includes the other two Beanstalk space stations. And then it looks like the surface of the planet got pretty wiped out almost immediately after that. So that's a good several billion human beings who all died at once. And where are all those consciousnesses supposed to go? Well, one possibility is some of them went into the X universe and did some interesting things. Another possibility is the Gnosis, which I made a video about. And the other thing is, a lot of them could probably get reincarnated as inhabitants of Allrest. Now, keep in mind, the inhabitants of Allrest, there's a whole lot less of them than the 8+ billion people who would have been on Earth at the time of its destruction. Based on what we know about how big the Titans can be, and then the fact that we go to a lot of the major cities in Allrest, we're probably looking at Renaissance Europe level human population on the entire planet. So that's a lot of consciousnesses that are still completely going unaccounted for. But there are still blades. I would be very unsurprised if those blades with core crystals that were based on old brain-mimicking technology also tied into the collective unconscious, and blade consciousnesses were actual people from the past world, and perhaps the fact that, okay, blades don't physically age in their blade form, so whatever age they show up, well, obviously their personality is heavily influenced by the driver imprinting on them and all that, that whatever age they show up as is tied to the age the person, the owner of the original consciousness, was at when they died or when Klaus did his thing. So that's just a side thing. And in fact, the whole reincarnation thing is completely alive and well in the form of blades. They reincarnate with new drivers every single lifetime, and while they can change and learn and evolve ever so slowly on the march to becoming titans, they are still largely the same and have a lot of similar values and goals and stuff in every successive life. And that led me down the road of thinking, alright, what if the people on the space station are wittingly or otherwise still carrying out something similar to what they were initially trying to do back when they first died with Earth? And then I realized, the Amalthus-looking guy is trying to stop Klaus. Klaus becomes the architect. Amalthus is trying to destroy the architect. Now, he has his own reasons and stuff, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was his past self coming back to haunt him, and he's basically continuing the dream of stopping Klaus completely unconsciously that his initial incarnation had back on Earth. Add on to that the fact that the station manager looks a bit like Gort, and without spoiling Torna, Gort does work for Amalthus there, so he is also indirectly working to stop Klaus, and you get some really interesting things going on. Another one of the models that I think gets repeated a couple times in some of the background shots of the space station looks a little bit like Mikhail. He's also tied to Indal, he got his powers from there, and he also is working to destroy the architect, so there's another one in there, and we don't see anyone who really resembles a blade at all. Like, there's one woman who looks a little bit like Morag. Like, Maya Fey is also there next to the Amalthus-looking guy. I don't know how she snuck her way onto a space station. But I think it's really interesting how there's a good potential for a lot of people who are working against the architect in Allrest during the time of the game actually just straight up being reincarnations of people who are on the space station working to stop Klaus from destroying the world and creating Allrest in the first place. Now, obviously, with this whole blade thing, Malos and Pyra, Mithra, Numa, they're exempt from everything I'm talking about here. And that's because we know as a fact they weren't initially blades. They both got their personalities from being imprinted on by a driver and being awoken as blades, but they were initially, the Trinity processor cores were raised in simulations to get their own distinct AI personalities before that, so I think it would be more likely that them specifically are more based on just imprinting overlaid on top of that existing AI personality, which may or may not have had its own consciousness, as opposed to something being drawn out of the collective unconscious through a core crystal. And there you go, there's an explanation for how blades work and how their memories exist. It's kind of weird how something can go completely inert and then be reawakened and still have memories of itself. Well, what if core crystals, instead of just working with ether and doing all that stuff, they're also necessary for drawing someone's consciousness back out of the collective, and each one is synced to a specific consciousness. Keep in mind, Haze, when she gets her core crystal split, she straight up forgets things that she's supposed to remember between awakenings, like her name. She loses her identity because her core crystal has been damaged. That looks like it checks out with a lot of this to me. And I don't really have any good way to end this. I just guess it would be remiss to not mention that Etika noticed the Gramps thing when he played through it, and I think he might have said something about potentially people being reincarnations of stuff. And then just the fact that, wow, all of this reasonably sense-making theory just came from a cost-cutting measure that was probably completely unintentional in the first place. So yeah,